I want to welcome you all to the launch of Rabbi Shmuley Boteach's newest book, Kosher Jesus, what promises to be a captivating panel discussion on the legacy of Jesus among Jews and Christians. The Values Network has a very simple mandate: to spread universal Jewish values to mainstream America as a way of healing families, diverting society's focus from materialism and towards spirituality, and inspiring children and adults to lead lives of purpose and service. One of our cornerstone initiatives, turned Friday night into family night, is sparking a national trend to an American Sabbath. I like to call that it's not a suggestion, it's a commandment idea. The idea is to reserve one night of the week without distractions to spend with family and friends. It doesn't sound that revolutionary, but it is, and it's changed my family's life, and hopefully a lot of families in this room. So please log on to www.fridayisfamily.com to view our Celebrity PSA campaign. And since the Values Network is a nonprofit organization, we invite you to help us continue with events like the one you're going to witness tonight by using the donation forms on the back of your programs to join us as partners. Please do that. After tonight's program, Shmuley's book will also be on sale in the lobby as well. It's a terrific book. Now, it is my honor and privilege to introduce tonight's esteemed guests. We'll begin with America's Rabbi, my good friend Shmuley Boteach. Newark Mayor, I live next door to Newark, and I'm in his city on a daily basis, Mr. Cory Booker.
I just want the record to show nobody applaud for Shmuley.
I'm supposed to be sitting on his lap, and he won't let me.
We've got Harvard Law School professor Noah Feldman over there. Wall Street Journal columnist Bret Stephens. And this evening's program will be moderated by Jane Eisner, the editor-in-chief of The Forward. So it gives me great pleasure to turn the program over to Mayor Booker for opening remarks.
I want the record to show that I did applaud for Mayor Booker.
The reason why I have opening remarks is because when in a relationship with Shmuley, you learn very early you never get the last word. It is an honor to be here, especially to be standing on the right of four very esteemed individuals. I don't know if I can often say that I'm on the right of a Wall Street Journal columnist, but I am standing here boldly nonetheless. In addition to that, to have someone of such esteem of a periodical as The Forward, it gives me great pleasure. I do want to focus in on just one point before I get to the meat of what I really want to say, on the other person on this panel, which is Noah Feldman. Noah is a longtime friend of mine. We both knew each other when we were in our 20s, and we met indeed on the voyage to Oxford before we after we were named Rhodes Scholars and before we actually ventured over there. I'm just proud to be a person who's watched his career and the impact he's having not only on the students he teaches as a professor, but frankly, he's one of those minds in our country that has afforded wisdom and strength to our national intellectual dialogue, as well as to the larger themes and ideas that are shaping the globe right now. I talked to his parents who are here remarkably on the way in, and I said to them in my best Newark, New Jersey speak I could, said that your son must give you incredible nachas possible, at which my Puerto Rican security guard thought I was talking about something else when I went like this. But I assure you, that was a rated PG comment, indeed. But Noah is one of those friends that gives everyone who loves and respects him great nachas as well. So it's just an honor to be here with Noah very quickly. And I'm happy again that Shmuley is bringing us together almost 20 years since the first time he and I shared Shabbat dinners there. So now I have
Well, I met Noah on the eve of Yom Kippur, just as you arrived. It was the eve of Yom Kippur. And you and I met since Yom Kippur is about 15 days before Simchas Torah.
Exactly.
I've known him 15 days longer than you.
So are you saying you were, no. You stand corrected, sir. I met Noah a few days before Yom Kippur. So I am the better Noah.
Okay, I can't respond to that.
You can see that you're lucky that I'm not sitting on this panel where the conversation would be quite combative. Shmuley actually used to be 6'3" until I had hands on him. And I, of course...
But I remain a giant in stature.
Yeah, yes. And I, of course, before I knew Shmuley, had a lot more hair. So I'd like to just frame my thoughts with a recent commentary. My first trip to Jerusalem, to Israel, I was supposed to be traveling with Rabbi Boteach, and he, as always, finds some way to make my life complicated. But I'm off going to Israel knowing nobody there, really, and get word from him that he cannot go with me. Now, before I could lose my temper, I realized that the reason he had was pretty extraordinary. The Rebbe had passed away. This was 1994, and Shmuley departed and went. I actually met up with someone that I knew from Oxford there and ended up having a fantastic trip. This past December, I went back to Israel. First time I had been there in over a decade. And this time I was bringing my mom and dad with me for their very first trip to Israel. It was an extraordinary journey to do it with your parents, to give them, as a son, to give them an opportunity to see Israel, to see Jerusalem. For them as Christian parents of mine, to stand where no one argues that Jesus stood, to see where he was in prison, to see the general path that he walked to the hill where he was eventually crucified, was for them and for me to share it with them a monumental experience. As an African-American Christian who grew up in a small black church in northern New Jersey, there was another moment that was pretty powerful to me. My parents went to bed, and I talked about this with Shmuley the last Shabbat I shared with him about 2 weeks ago. And the two Israeli guides, former Special Forces guys, said to me, "Now your parents are asleep, it's late, would you like to go for a ride with us?" And I wasn't thinking. Usually when I'm here in the United States, I'm more concerned about security. I have my friends here with me today. And I just end up jumping into this truck with these two Israeli Special Forces men. And before I knew it, they literally left all roads and highways, and they're going up hills in the desert. And I'm beginning to think to myself, did I tell anybody where I was going? Is this what they do with the Goyim that visit? You know, will they ever hear from me again? And I'm beginning to think. I pull out my cell phone, no reception. I'm like, I can't text, help. I'm in the Israeli desert. We ascend to a hill, and finally I see lights of civilization, and I begin to pray to God like I had never prayed before, prayers of thanks and gratitude. And you know, I started singing, "Yes, Jesus loves me," and tried to get them to join on, but we stopped, and they began to construct a fire, and then they brought me over to show me what I was looking at, and they basically said that this was Mount Nebo. And I'm one of those Bible readers that when it comes to the complicated words of names and places, I sometimes gloss over them. And so it took me a second to know what Mount Nebo was, but they told me that this was the place where Moses came onto the mountaintop and looked over and saw the Promised Land. Now, interestingly, I actually knew, having a very good rabbi who I do try often to study Torah with, and Rabbi Shmuley and I still have may try to make time to go over what the Torah portion is regularly. I knew actually at that point what the Torah portion was at that time in December, and it was that wonderful moment where you see Joseph be taken. I shouldn't call it a wonderful moment, a tragic moment, where Joseph is taken by his brothers and thrown into a well. And the reason why suddenly I started getting chills and turned to my two Israeli friends to explain to them what this moment meant to me, knowing what the Torah reading was, knowing what I was looking at. And I basically said to them, I said, "Do you understand, as an African American, as a Christian, I grew up hearing stories that are profoundly embodied by this moment of what I'm witnessing, this spiritual connection between the Torah portion and what I'm looking at." And they didn't understand, because what does the Torah portion have to do with looking at Mount Nebo? What does Joseph being thrown into the well have to do with Moses standing on the mountaintop? And I knew that in Memphis, Tennessee, at the very site that Martin Luther King was assassinated, in the Lorraine Motel, you have this inscription that comes from the Torah, comes from the Old Testament, that is written right there. And it says, "Behold, here cometh the dreamer. Let us slay him and see what becomes of his dreams." And then I looked at Mount Nebo and I said that hours before that Martin Luther King was killed, where that inscription is, hours before that, he gave one of his most famous speeches, the mountaintop speech, where he said, I have been to the mountaintop, and I have seen over, and I have seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I'm fearing no man, for my eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. And I pulled out my one of the Israeli gentlemen's iPad, now getting reception. I pulled down that very speech and let them listen to the words of Martin Luther King. And hear this Christian minister's words, standing in a hilltop in the middle of Israel, had the same impact upon them, the same chills that gave to them, the same meaning suddenly came to their heart. And the depth of our connection and the spiritual power of that moment was visited upon them as well. So here we are today because of a rabbi who is probably one of the more provocative forces in the American religious world. He has in my life, to be very frank with you, despite all his massive imperfections and frailties.
Is there another rabbi here?
Rabbi Boteach actually has been one of my spiritual friends and guides. Because as a Christian, he helped me fulfill one of my college mentors' profound statements. He said, if you consider yourself a Christian, you must understand Judaism. You must take time to learn about the Torah and understand the fact that Jesus himself was a Jew. And when I get to Oxford, before I know it, by a set of events I could have never imagined, the universe conspired to have me meet this Meshuggah man next to me and actually begin to study Torah in a way that enriched my faith, deepened my not only connection to my own conceptions of God, but even in a maybe perhaps a more profound way, deepened my love and connection to the Jewish people. And so we live in a complicated world where often religion is much more about dividing one from another than it is about unifying. That often religion is about establishing lines and not crossing them. Often religion is about exclusivity and not inclusivity. Often religion is about independent thought and not interdependent interactions. What Shmuley created in Oxford was profound to me. That here, this man sent over by the great Rebbe, Menachem Schneerson, created a table in Oxford that became not only a center of Jewish life in Oxford, but attracted so many non-Jews. Attracted Christians, attracted Muslims, attracted atheists, attracted the grandson of the prophet of the Mormon church, all around his table. There's a song sung in the holidays that Shmuley, some Hebrew that Shmuley taught me, Ki beiti beit tefillah l'chochol mi, which is a song that Jews sing. It says, may my house be a house of prayer for all of God's children. And to me, this is what Shmuley has created. But what I love about him is when he steps into controversy. And he writes this book about Jesus that now has him being attacked by just about every angle, which I tend to think is where he's most comfortable. I tend to think that he, in many ways, revels in this understanding. And to me, it's actually a spiritual ideal. That if we grow too comfortable, if we grow too relaxed, if we don't find ways to leave our comfort zones, to engage in thoughtful dialogue on those subjects that most people don't want to bring up in polite conversation, then we will never grow as a country. Martin Luther King said the most segregated time of every week is Sunday mornings, when blacks go one place to play, whites go another place to pray. The truth of the matter is, if we are ever to create a greater world, if we are ever to cocoon along, we must have books like this that force us not only to confront our own belief systems, but hopefully more importantly, push us to understand each other even more. Because a fundamental element of love ultimately will always be understanding. So today I want to give Shmuley thanks. I'm one of those people that encouraged him to write this book. We used to have conversations about Jesus back in Oxford, and he was an amazing master of the Christian Bible. And while I get teased now as a black Christian for knowing more about the Torah than many of my Jewish friends, the truth is that Shmuley knows more about the Christian Bible than many Christian friends. And there, in my opinion, is one of the no greater provocateur around the subject of Jesus, to not only stimulate conversation, debate, and controversy, but ultimately to stimulate love, understanding, and connection than Rabbi Shmuley Boteach. As meshuggah as he is, as imperfect as he is, as short as he is, as hairy as he is, the truth of the matter is...
As wise as he is, as good looking as he is.
The truth of the matter is, I am proud to say Shmuley Boteach is my friend, and I will, even though I'm 6'3", I will always look up to him.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mayor Booker is going to have to leave shortly, and I'm very grateful that he came. We're going to take one picture with our panel, and then we're going to continue. Okay? Let me just add, as we turn over to our very esteemed moderator.
Who's getting the last word?
I'm so surprised. I wasn't sure I wanted to publish this book because I knew that the ramifications might be extreme, very severe. And one night, it's an amazing story. I'll tell you very quickly because the person whom it considers is actually here. But Corey and I have a very close mutual friend named Mark Person. Where's Mark Person? Hello, Mark Person. So Mark was getting married. Corey called. This is an amazing story. Corey calls me up on a Thursday night, and I'm having dinner with my kids and my wife. And he says to me, he says, "I'm picking you up in 20 minutes." I said, "Where are we going?" He said, "It's a surprise." I said, "Corey, are things out?" He said, "Cancel them. I'm cutting short a speech to 800 cops for something special for our friend who's getting married." He picks me up 20 minutes later. I'm in his car with his security. I said, "Where are we going?" He said, "It's a surprise. We go to Manhattan." Suddenly Mark, who's getting married on the next Saturday night, he doesn't know where we're going either. We're in Corey's car. We're driving over bridges. We're in Brooklyn. We're in Queens. And Corey takes us to the grave of the Lubavitcher Rebbe to pray for Mark to pray before his wedding. It was Corey who took us to the grave of the Rebbe to pray before Mark's wedding. And on the way back, I shared with Mark and Corey that I had been writing this manuscript for like 6 or 7 years, did not know if I wanted to publish it. And here's the general thesis about Jesus. And they both began to encourage me to write the book. And it really was Corey's inspiration. And all the good things that you say about me, we of course warmly reciprocate. Corey, you are America's mayor. You are the one who's doing outstanding things in the political arena. You are loved in the Jewish community, the Christian community, the white community, the black community, because you transcend any kind of political division. You've always brought people together. And that's the purpose of Kosher Jesus, to try to bring Jews and Christians together. So thank you very much. It's all of the inaccuracies about my imperfections.
Yes, well, to wear on you, Brett and the rest of the panel a little bit more, the truth of the matter is Mark and I were sitting in the back seat just conspiring about how to get you not to write another book about sex. Especially one that made me stop telling you anything about my personal life, because I appear in books where, I have a friend named Cornelius, who is mayor of Newark, Delaware. So I'm very happy this is a book about Jesus and not a book about my personal life.
So, ladies and gentlemen, first I'd like to welcome you again to this wonderful event. There are a few empty seats right here in the front, so if you're standing in the back and would like to sit down, please do join us. Here's what's going to happen tonight, I think. I think this is going to be more free-flowing than organized. But we will hear from our esteemed Rabbi, Shmuley Boteach, who's going to give us a brief, I promised, overview of his new book and the arguments in it. And then we'll have a pretty freewheeling conversation with our panelists here. And at some point in the evening, we'll open it up to you to have your chance to ask Shmuley or any of the other panelists your questions. So please join me in welcoming Shmuley Boteach.
When I told Jane that I would be brief, I meant it in Jewish terms. Let me first thank all of the people who have donated their time this evening. Not one person here is being remunerated. Beginning with Jane Eisner. Jane is the editor of one of the most respected publications, not just Jewish, but any in the United States. The Forward is read by people well beyond the Jewish community. She's an outstanding and highly regarded journalist, and thank you for giving us a reading. We're very grateful. And indeed, Professor Noah Feldman, who has been my dear friend for 2 decades, and read the Torah for us every Saturday, every Shabbos at Oxford, and studied Talmud with me several times a week and taught me so much. Noach is a world-class scholar in virtually every field. I have rarely in my life met anyone as erudite. When he was at Oxford, he probably set the Oxford University record. It's a 900-year-old university for the fastest DPhil doctorate of all time. He helped work on the Iraqi constitution. He was hand-chosen by the Pentagon.
See how well that worked out.
And by Donald Rumsfeld. He is universally regarded as one of the greatest living American constitutional experts, even though yesterday's New York Times said our Constitution is going down the drain.
They're wrong.
And he's one of the most, and he's an academic superstar. And what an honor to have him. Thank you so much. And finally, Bret Stephens is regarded by many as the most accomplished conservative op-ed writer in the United States today, certainly for his age, and certainly one of the most celebrated writers in the United States today. He was my editor at the Jerusalem Post. When he was 28 years old, he became the editor-in-chief of one of the world's most recognized journalistic brands. And now, every Tuesday in the Wall Street Journal, you will read his column. His column yesterday on how Israel, in parentheses, Israel, Shabam, Iran, was quite remarkable. It scared the living daylights out of me, but really was the most sober assessment of that very delicate situation that I read. And thank you very much for being here, especially in light of the fact that Bret recently lost his father. And I'm very grateful that you came, and I hope that his memory will be to you an eternal blessing. And I had to welcome the people who came on my behalf, and thank you all very much to all of you who attended as well. So let me talk briefly about Kosher Jesus and go straight to our panel. For those of you who watched the furor over the book, which, it propelled it to the bestseller lists around the world, thank God, and it got a full-page write-ups in places like the Los Angeles Times, yesterday's London Times. Not that it was worth it, because it's been a very painful experience the past few weeks. But the major argument from the Jewish critics, which we never expected, is that Christians want to steal our souls. Christians want to proselytize us. And by writing a book called Kosher Jesus, you're inviting them in to accomplish that goal. My friends, times have changed completely. Over the past 20 years, there has been a revolution in Jewish-Christian relations. Christians are today the most reliable, dependable friends the State of Israel has. This started, actually, with the Catholic Church, not even with the evangelicals, in Vatican II, about 1962, under the phenomenal friend of the Jewish people, John XXIII, who I consider the greatest of the popes. He absolved the Jews in charge of deicide. We were no longer responsible for the death of Jesus. Christian evangelicals in the United States, who number 80 million, 1 out of 5 Americans is a born-again Christian, they took up from there. They're not out to snatch our souls today. They really want to learn so much about the Jewishness of Jesus. And whenever you have Jewish groups coming together, or Christian groups like Pastor John Hagee's Kufite dinner, Christians United for Israel, which I attended in D.C., it's quite remarkable. We all talk about this political alliance for Israel. Christians talk about how they're blessed through the Jewish people, as is stated clearly in the Bible. But the one thing neither community can mention, that is always ignored, the 600-pound gorilla in the room, is the mention of Jesus. The Christian pastors don't mention it. The Jews, of course, don't mention it. The net result is that it's a relationship built on a foundation, seemingly, of fraudulence, because Jesus was a Jew. Now, Time magazine, 2 years ago, in their annual edition of the 10 Ideas Most Changing the World, said that idea number 7 is the Christian desire to learn about the Jewishness of Jesus. Now, given that beginning at Oxford, I had thousands of non-Jewish members, many of whom were devout Christians, I started studying Christianity very seriously. And I also began to debate Christian missionaries. You can see many of them on YouTube, especially with Dr. Michael Brown. He and I will be debating this book on March the 13th here in Manhattan, God willing. I began to see that virtually everything Jesus taught was based on Jewish scripture. That the story of Jesus as related to Christians was not the full story. That if you actually look at the development of the synoptic gospels in their chronological order, meaning Mark, Matthew, Luke, before we get to John, which is a departure from the synoptic gospels, the story of Jesus actually changes very significantly. The entire Sermon on the Mount, I traced back verse for verse back to its original origin. Even teachings that are used to berate Jews, that the Jews have the vindictive God of the Old Testament who says that you have to take an eye for an eye, but Jesus taught, turn the other cheek to those who hate you. This comes from Lamentations chapter 2, everything he taught. Now we have all been taught that Jesus was an enemy of Judaism, hated by the Pharisees, and was put to death by the Jews as they handed him over to a reluctant Pontius Pilate because he wanted to start a new religion. None of that, I believe, can bear the scrutiny of scholarship. The 5 reasons that it is said that why Jesus was the Jews wanted him dead, none of them bear can hold up to scrutiny. They said, number 1, Jesus wanted to change the Torah. Matthew chapter 5, verse 18, Jesus says, whoever refuses to keep even one yud of the Torah, the smallest letter of the Hebrew alphabet, if you give that up, you will be the least in the kingdom of heaven. The religion of Jesus was Judaism, not Christianity. He lived as a Jew. He practiced as a Jew. He was devoted to every last Jewish ritual. The second thing they told us is that Jesus broke the Sabbath by allowing his followers to pick wheat and grain on the Sabbath. But Jesus justifies it by telling the Pharisees who criticize him that it is not man who is created for the Sabbath, it is the Sabbath is created for man. That is directly from the Talmud. It's the same formula used by rabbis today to allow a husband, say, to drive his wife to the hospital if she's in labor because the Sabbath is created for man. What he was saying is that his students had to break the Sabbath to save their lives. More on that later. Number 3, we're told that Jesus was put to death by the Jews because he claimed to be God. He called himself a child of the Son of God. First of all, the book of Deuteronomy makes it clear we are all children of God. It's a common Jewish expression. And when Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man, which is much more common in the Gospels, it's the appellation used by most Jewish prophets, especially by Ezekiel. Ben Adam simply means son of Adam. And every single one of you here is a son of man. Number 4, we're told that Jesus was put to death by the Jews because he claimed to be the Messiah. There is nothing wrong with anyone claiming to be the Messiah. I can declare to you right now, I am Shmuley Boteach, and I am the Jewish Messiah. And my wife believes it. Actually, she probably least believes it. My mother might believe it. In Judaism, the only thing we do once you declare yourself to be the Messiah is we examine whether you fulfilled the Messianic prophecies. There is nothing blasphemous about it in the slightest, and many have made that declaration, and some of them are considered great rabbis till this very day. Many people believe the Lubavitcher Rebbe, when he was alive, was the Messiah. But if he died without fulfilling the Messianic prophecies, then he's not. There's nothing blasphemous about it. Finally, number 5, they say that Jesus blasphemed by claiming to be God. By the way, there's nothing in religion that says if you claim to be God, that is not blasphemy. In Judaism, blasphemy is where you curse God. If any of you stood up and said, "Hi, Shmuley, nice to meet you. I'm the creator of heaven and earth. I'm God," we'd probably think, you might need some psychological help. But it would not be blasphemous. But indeed, Jesus never even makes the claim. He never once claims that he's God until we get to the book of John. So the book traces all of Jesus' teachings back to their original source in Judaism. They show that we had no motive to want to put Jesus to death. Pontius Pilate was the Hitler of the ancient world. Later, when there's more time, I will read to you just the beginning of this outstanding new book by Simon Sebag Montefiore, where he describes the Romans, around the time of the destruction of the temple, had crucified hundreds of thousands of Jews for political offenses. This was very common, unfortunately. Pontius Pilate was recalled by the Romans, by the Emperor Tiberius, for his cruelty. To be considered cruel by the Romans is like being considered rich by Warren Buffett's standards. So the idea that the Jews would have said in Matthew, "His blood be upon us and upon our children," demanding that an innocent Jesus be put to death by a recalcitrant Pilate, again, does not bear any, can't stand up to the eye of scholarship and scrutiny. And the book then goes on to explain what the real Jesus was and what Christians can learn from it. That's some of it. I don't want to speak anymore, and thank you very much. Jane.
Okay, so let's start with your motive for writing this book. And you talk about trying to really deepen the understanding of Christians and Jews. And Brett, I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about that in a more contemporary context. As somebody who really looks carefully at current events, and as we noted, there certainly are political alliances between, especially evangelical Christians and some Jews in this country, but at the same time, a lot of political differences. Would you like to pick up on that?
Do you want me to start, or do you want to?
Yeah, why don't you start?
Well, first of all, it's really an honor to be here, and particularly to listen. Sorry, it's an honor to be here and to share this podium with Mayor Booker. As a matter of fact, when Shmuley told me a few months ago that he was about to come out with a book called Kosher Jesus, my first thought was that it was the authorized biography of Cory Booker. I don't pretend I'm an ink-stained wretch and a foreign affairs columnist, so I'm not going. I read the book. I enjoyed the book. I do give some thought to the question of the rapprochement, which I don't think is quite as dramatic as you suggested in your remarks just a couple of minutes ago, between Christians and Jews and what it means. And it reminds me a little bit of what Napoleon's mother is alleged to have said when asked what she thinks of her son's military successes and triumphs and coronation and all the rest of it. This is, around the time of Austerlitz, not the Russian campaign. And the famous answer was, "Pour vous qui ça dura," so long as it lasts. And I think that's a kind of a useful template for us to discuss the alliance of sorts that is being created in a variety of places, not at all uniformly or consistently, but certainly to a very visible extent in the United States between Christians and Jews. And while I was reading Shmuly's book, the thought that kept running in my mind, maybe it's because it advertises on the cover that you are also the author of the international blockbuster Kosher Sex, is whether it's possible that we might not draw lessons from kosher sex or maybe kosher adultery that those lessons might not be more apposite to the topic of Christians and Jews and their political future together than the lessons of kosher Jesus, interesting as they are. What I mean by that is this. I think that certainly when you read the entirety of the book, particularly the chapters that deal with the different Jews and Christians and how fundamental and how decisive they are, you understand that this is a relationship that is only going to go so far. By all means, there's a value of this is an interesting metaphor in this audience, or this context, but by all means, if you want to get into bed with one another, okay, but dim the lights, because you don't want to look too closely in this, or examine one another's faiths too closely, lest you recoil at what you are seeing. I have spoken at Christian groups, Baptist Christian churches in the American South. In fact, I've been invited to give a speech to 10,000 evangelicals in Memphis, Tennessee, sometime in June, Christians for Israel. And I'm very happy to do this. And as a political matter, I think it's broadly speaking a wonderful thing. By all means, I'd rather have 80 million evangelical Christians supporting Israel and lending their political weight to that cause than 80 million evangelical Christians opposing Israel and doing the opposite. But this is a relationship which can get only so close before there might be some mutual recoiling going on. American Jews, I think, for a long time have, to a certain extent, with some kind of intuitive wisdom, felt deeply uncomfortable about the solicitude that they're getting from American Christians. And I know this is probably not doesn't square with your views, Shmuly. I'd be curious to know what you say about it. But it reminds me a little bit of the feeling of being loved by someone more than you actually love yourself. To sit and talk to an American Jew about Israel, or an Israeli, you talk about problems, you talk about difficulties. To have that same conversation with an American Christian is almost this nauseating tidal wave of love and appreciation and respect and so on. And it's nice up to a point, but in a way, it's a suggestion that what they are seeing is what they choose to see. And what they are seeing is an image constructed in their mind that happens to be convenient at a given point in time with their political worldview. Let me offer an example. I mean, you know where I come from politically in terms of my views on Israeli politics. But a lot of evangelical support for Israel comes from the fact that Israelis are the keepers of, core holy places. What happens if Israel decides that it's going to withdraw from the territories? from Hebron, from large portions of Jerusalem. Does the support for Israel remain, or have Jews in some sense betrayed some promise that they in fact never made, never offered? I think that's worth considering, just how deep this alliance is and how profound, and whether it is actually founded on a friendship or someone just wanting to be your friend because they think you are something you are not. I think that's very well worth considering. And American Jews, by the same token, I think need to look on the one hand with some appreciation at American Christians, or the Christian movement that's come around to defend and speak up for Israel. But that Christian community is also prone to sudden shifts and changes, and we should be mindful of that. Look, something politically important has happened. I always laugh when I'm told the Israel lobby is responsible for American support for Israel, because it's a complete joke. The Christian lobby, or deep Christian sentiments in the country, is responsible for U.S. support for Israel. There's a lot to celebrate and there's a lot to learn. But just remember, don't get too close, or if you do, dim the lights, because this love affair bears only so much scrutiny.
Thank you. Shmuley, would you like to respond?
I take everything, all the nice things about Brett that I said, I take them back. Clearly he's a man who's very confused. No, look, if Brett says something, you got to take it very seriously, and I like his metaphor about dimming the lights. But I don't agree. I actually think that relationships are based on intimacy and on knowledge. And dimming the lights can only work for so long, and I think it's ultimately not going to work for the reasons that you're raising. That if the Jewish-Christian alliance is based on nothing but a political bridge without any kind of theological bridge, if it's not based on shared values, if it's not based on somewhat of a shared story, that indeed that political alliance can change once Israel makes political decisions that are not in accord with Christian sentiment, as you just said. The fact is that the essence of this relationship should be the Jewishness of Jesus, even as we understand Jesus in totally different ways. It doesn't make any sense that we Jews, who've been an influential nation with our ideas, we've been powerless but very influential, should have allowed the most famous personality that ever lived to have been ripped away from us without even a struggle, based on a Christian rendering of his story, without us having ever really even examined that story, when Christians want to learn from us about who he was. So the theological undertaking, I think, is important for its own sake. And I even believe that it has political ramifications here in the United States, Brett, beyond the Alliance for a Secure Israel. Christian evangelicals are, in the minds of most Americans, a mixed bag. On the one hand, they believe in faith, and they raise good families, and they criticize the increasingly decadent culture. On the other hand, and they want better things for this country. And by the way, 60% of the U.S. military is evangelical Christians. They're very patriotic. On the other hand, the other side of it is they're seen as politically divisive. They harp usually on issues like abortion and gay marriage. We just saw yesterday in California again. I think part of the solution to all this is to stop highlighting the divinity of Christ and start highlighting the humanity of Jesus. A human Jesus allows people to struggle a little bit more. A human Jesus is a bit more forgiving. A human Jesus doesn't engage in cultural wars the entire time as if it's Christ battling Satan and Jesus being tempted in the desert by Satan. There are many stories of the Jewishness of Jesus that have been overlooked completely. My principal criticism against Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, aside from it being nothing but a violent, gory, bloodthirsty film, which was deeply anti-Semitic, and I said it at the time. And by the way, Jan, I'm turning my back toward you. For those of you not sitting on these chairs, they really have a mind of their own. My problem with this movie was that it did not focus on the humanity of Jesus, or the teachings of Jesus, or the life of Jesus. It was a 2-hour blood spectacle about the death of Jesus. That's all he did was die. And I said this to my Christian friends. That's the only thing that inspires you, is that Jesus got nailed to a cross by the Romans? You mean nothing he taught? By the way, if you read the book of Matthew, the death of Jesus is about 2 chapters. And the same thing is true with all the other Gospels. It does not loom large. When Jesus was alive, and for 300 years after his death, the crucifix, the cross, was not even a Christian symbol. This was started by Constantine. The fish, or the dove, was a symbol of Christ, and his life was focused on. Now, if you look in the book of Matthew, Jesus is very human. The Romans are nailing him to a cross, and he screams, my God, why have you forsaken me? Keli, Keli, lama, it's a misquotation actually. Lama zabachthani, why have you slaughtered me? It's a quotation from Psalms. Lama azantani, why have you abandoned me? Only later you get to the book of John, does Jesus say it is done. In other words, it's a plan. He's laying his life down voluntarily for the sin of mankind. He did struggle. There was a human Jesus. America, because of this large, very positive Christian voting bloc, has to discover the humanity of Jesus. If not, we're going to continue, I believe, to have all these cultural wars. I think that we're going to highlight values issues that are not very relevant. I don't care about the gay marriage debate anymore. It has distracted us from far bigger conversations like divorce. There's a 50% divorce rate. Maybe 5% of the population is lesbian or gay, and all we ever talk about is gay marriage. In the meantime, American kids are being raised as yo-yos like I was between households with no security. They go from this house, that, and no one talks about divorce. The human Jesus needs to be highlighted. And I think for its own sake, therefore, it's important.
Just very briefly, that's all well and good, and actually if you read Jefferson's, all of Jefferson's writings, Jefferson one day devotes 40 pages to extracting the true lessons of Jesus from the perversions of Christianity. It's one of the sort of charming aspects of reading, Jefferson's entire works. Jefferson has his own version of his own Jesus, and it's done sort of brilliantly, but that's not Christianity. And this is a point that I think needs to be stressed. You have, in a sense, I'm speaking as a Jew, rescued Jesus for the Jewish people in a very interesting and provocative, and I thought very convincing way. But that's not what Christians believe. Paul is the founder of the Christian church. So what you call this sort of overlay of, this kind of invidious interpolation by latter-day, by the apostles, and then people like St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas. St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, these, certainly if you're a Catholic, these are central figures in Christian intellectual life. And so when we were talking about Christianity, we're not talking about, we can have an interesting and somewhat speculative debate about whether it's the religion of Jesus, but that's like wondering whether the Iliad was written by Homer or just another Greek by the same name. The real question is Christianity as we know it today. Now that Christianity is, I think, evolving, as all religions do. It's a much more tolerant, Catholic in the kind of original sense of the word, religion. It's much more interested in its roots and its origins, and it's much more interested in what it shares with other faith traditions. But let's not forget that this is the Christianity that we have is linked to the people whom you condemn in the book as being, as desecrating the memory and meaning of Jesus's life.
Well, only to say I think condemn is much too strong a word. But what I am saying is they can say whatever they want, but it has to be consistent with Jesus' message, because it is not Augustine and it is not Paul who are seen as the founders of Christianity. Christianity is based on the life and legacy of Jesus, not of Constantine or Paul.
So Noah, why don't we ask you to weigh in a little bit on giving us some kind of historical context for this wonderful dialogue that we've already created here.
Sure, I think Brett and Shmuley are off to a great start here. And I know that Shmuley considers himself a figure of historic importance, so I'm really grateful to be here. I think the contribution that I can make is to give you some context, and I just want to focus very briefly on two histories from a long time ago and one on more contemporary history. So first, I just want to say a very quick word about the history of attempts to understand the life of Jesus of Nazareth, and where Shmuley's book may fit into that, and your debate is connected to that. Second, a word about specifically Jewish attempts to make sense of what Jesus and Christianity as a whole means for the Jewish community and the Jewish world, because that's obviously a very important audience for your book as well, at least those people who don't consider the book already banned based on its title. And last, a little bit about the specific historical context in which we find ourselves now, having to do both with the kind of remarkable historic decline of anti-Semitism and also with a very distinctive feature of your book, Shmuley, which is, you alluded to in your comments, which is its relationship to the Lubavitcher Rebbe's own life and the question of his messianism and as how that's played out in the contemporary context. So very, very briefly, let me just start with the question of who was Jesus of Nazareth. There's probably not a more controversial topic today among Christians. And the scholarship on Jesus and his life, which really began in an academic sense as early as the Renaissance, and really got going during the Enlightenment. That's when Thomas Jefferson was giving his version of Jesus, who, by the way, is very much like Shmuley's, in that he's not divine and is not resurrected. So that's what Jefferson's Bible looks like. It's just a Bible with all the references to Jesus' divinity removed and why statements included. And then hit its stride in the 19th century with the invention of German critical scholarship, which subjected not only the Gospels, but more famously, the Hebrew Bible, to critical analysis, attempting to look at what its sources were, attempting to verify its historicity where possible, and calling into question features that seem not to jive with history. So, interestingly, a lot of what Shmuley is doing in this book, and I was extremely curious when I picked it up to see how Shmuley would do it, because it's very different from his other books. A lot of what Shmuley is doing here is critical biblical scholarship on the Gospels. Right? He's trying to figure out what's true and what isn't true, and he uses the techniques that many people who do this kind of scholarship today and have done it for the last 150 years use, namely imagining the historical context, but also asking, what would Jesus have done? And you do it for the other characters in the Gospels too, like Pilate. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing that. In fact, all historians have to do a lot of that. Right? You're always juxtaposing what data you have, and in this case the data is minimal, just these Gospel stories, with what you think is true about the history. But there is a danger in doing this of the old joke about the question of how do you know that our forefather Abraham wore a yarmulke? Right? Do you know this joke?
Yes.
Well, the Bible says Abraham went out. And would our forefather Abraham have gone out without a yarmulke? Right? That's a form of logic that really every historian has to be wary of, and it's hard to avoid doing it.
But I find that very convincing.
There you go. And we always do. So the point I want to simply make here is that I think it's great that Shmuley is putting his, making his contribution to the ongoing debate, which is mostly taking place among Christians, about the historical Jesus and his relationship to what we ought to believe today. I'm with Brett in thinking that many Christians will be skeptical because they will say if you deny the fundamental premise of our faith, we are unlikely to get much benefit from the conversation. But because I believe that conversations actually continue, even when, to continue this metaphor, even when people are entangled and are unhappy to see each other full on, they still keep talking. And that's what's going on here. So Shmuley's book will become a part of a broader conversation about the historical Jesus, and I think that's a good thing. And I think it's important, Shmuley, to see your contribution as, in the same way that in the 60s we had Jesus, the radical guerrilla, and in the early part of the 20th century when the United States was becoming a global empire, we had the muscular Christianity of Jesus. Now we've got Jesus as, Shmuley Boteach, in some sense. A nationalist, committed, a nationalist, committed, traditionalist Jew who's interested in reaching out across communities. And I think that's great. I have no objection that way. The second thing I would say is about how Jews have thought about Christianity. In a section of his Code of Jewish Law, which is was censored in the Middle Ages and is often still censored in contemporary copies, Moses Maimonides says, more or less, and I'm paraphrasing here, it's a wonderful thing that Jesus of Nazareth and the Ishmaelite who followed him, he couldn't name Muhammad because he was living in the Muslim world, have spread belief in a single God and discussion of questions of the eternity of the resurrection of the dead and the obedience to laws all over the globe to people who would never have heard of it otherwise. Then he concludes that the reason this is good is it will enable people in the long run to get to true religious beliefs and values, which of course would require them to jettison certain features of Christianity or Islam. So that's a view that says we can see Christianity and Islam as good things, provided we get back to our beliefs. If you will, that's the analog to the views of some evangelicals who think that Israel is a great thing, and they're very happy to see the state of Israel, and equally looking forward to the day when the Jews in Israel and elsewhere will become Christians, and thereupon fulfill their historic mission and destiny. There is a variant on this, which you see, for example, in the 18th century in the works of a very important 18th century European rabbi, Jacob Emden, who goes further than this and essentially says that anyone who practices as a believing Christian is fully fulfilling the obligations that are incumbent on every human being under the Bible. Following what the Talmud and then later Maimonides referred to as the 7 laws of the sons of Noah, and essentially doing everything that they're supposed to do to go to heaven. And he says explicitly that Judaism accepts the idea of salvation outside the church. He specifically Emden contrasts the Jewish belief, according to him, with the Christian belief at the time, which many Christians, although not all, still believe, that it's impossible to achieve salvation outside the church. So that's another view, and I think maybe that's closer to Shmuly's view. And in this sense, I think it's important to mention this mostly because Shmuley is being attacked already very strongly in the Jewish world for his positive attitude towards Christianity and Jesus, and actually he has very strong precedent in Jewish tradition for this, and I think don't give up that part of the argument when it's being said.
Well, thanks for your support. I need...
Yeah, you do. Last, I think, but not at all least, it's interesting to note the context today for the production of this book. So Shmuley goes and speaks to evangelical groups, and there is a lively kind of quasi-dialogue at stake, and I think that's partly, Shmuley says in his book, what inspired you to work on the book. It is remarkable to note the dearth of anti-Semitism as it exists in the United States today. The United States today is the least anti-Semitic country, and I would say except for Jewish majority countries, but that's not true. The United States is less anti-Semitic today than Israel, in my view, in terms of the prevalence of anti-Semitic attitudes. It's the least anti-Semitic country that's ever existed on Earth. And that's an extraordinary fact, and one doesn't simply have to look at Christian support for Israel, though that's part of it, but just to compare the United States today to the United States of 50 or 60 or 75 years ago, and the last time we had a major financial crisis. To notice, and I won't say more about this because there's no reason to describe an argument that one could imagine being made that isn't being made, but one could imagine the kinds of arguments that could be made about the position of Jews in the United States today on the analog of the sort of high anti-Semitism of the 20s and 30s in Europe and the United States. They are astonishingly absent. Astonishingly absent. And that's a remarkable fact. And that has something to do with Shmuley's book. The Jewish fear that speaking about Jesus will lead to trouble, which unquestionably is behind some of the criticism, just doesn't apply here. But a lot of Jews don't know that because a lot of Jews never interact, especially in the traditional Jewish Orthodox Jewish community, never interact with Christians. Shmuley does, so it never crossed his mind to feel fear in this context, and in fact, I think fear would be an inappropriate reaction at this juncture. There is, however, a twist. I think the most original thing in this book, and I really think it's profoundly original in the whole enormous literature about Jesus. I mean, I don't know exactly if this is true, but if you look in the Dewey Decimal System under Jesus, I bet it's the largest entry, full stop, of any subject. Right? There is certainly no subject more widely written about in Western civilizational history. And there's something very original in Shmuley's book on this topic, and that is the argument that Jesus' claim to be the Messiah should be treated as perfectly normal within the context of normative Jewish life. That's a remarkable claim. Now, it's strictly speaking a claim about Judaism rather than a claim about Christianity, but it's a really interesting claim, and I think I was really glad that you did this, Shmuley, so I didn't have to do it. When Shmuley mentions the Lubavitcher Rebbe as someone whose followers believed him in his lifetime, many of whose followers believed him in his lifetime to be either the Messiah or the person on earth with the greatest probability of being the Messiah, so much so that after his death, some of his followers, again, no one knows exactly what percentage, but a significant number, struggled with the possibility that he was still the Messiah and was either still alive in an occultation, like the Shia vision of the vanished Imam, or possibly would return in some way, in a way that critics saw as analogous precisely to Christianity. So it's really interesting that in that context, and this is a very significant intellectual development in the thought world of Judaism in the last 20 years, mostly unknown to most of the Jewish public. You know, the development of a major sect within Judaism that's high visibility, very active, has done a tremendous amount of good, that has been internally riven by a deep split over the question of who is the Messiah. So in that context, for Shmuley to write this book and say, it's normal for people to think you're the Messiah, and it's no big deal, is really remarkable, and I think it could only have been written in this historical context. I think it's fascinating.
Can I just pick up on that a little bit, though, because in the section that you say this, Shmuley, you don't actually mention Rabbi Schneerson's name. as an example. You give other historical examples in Jewish history, Bar Kokhba, people who were who declared themselves to be a Messiah or were thought to be one. And I was wondering why you didn't mention the Rebbe's name.
I guess because I have enough problems. First of all, I think that Lubavitch Messianism has become an enormous global debate that I did not want to engage in this book. I knew the book would be controversial enough, talking about Jesus, let alone bringing in debates that I saw as distractions. But if you're asking me, Jane, to comment on that, I'm Lubavitch, I'm Chabad to my core. They can ban my book all they want, they can say that I can't speak here or there. Chabad is something I chose when I was beginning at the age of 8 years old. I raised my kids to be Chabad. My kids have Chabad names. I'm immensely proud of the fact that I'm Chabad. And the Rebbe was the guiding light and inspiration of my life. He is the reason I went to Sydney, Australia, and ultimately met my wife. My daughter just married a Chabad young man 3 months ago. My kids are in Chabad schools. And if that were, and the most painful thing about all these attacks recently from Chabad quarters, almost exclusively, has been the suggestion that it would impact on my children, etc. God forbid, because my kids have been raised to love Chabad. I therefore find it to be an immense affront to the Rebbe's memory that his name has been ensnared into this global debate as to whether he needed to be more than one of the greatest Jewish leaders of all time. That's what's so sad. It's almost like the people who are insisting the Rebbe, even in his death, is still the Messiah, are essentially saying that if he's not, he failed. I mean, the Rebbe brought about a global resuscitation of the Jewish people by believing that even after the Holocaust, we could re-interest people after this cataclysm that we couldn't explain. And after secularism had become the norm for most Jews, especially in the United States, he believed that Jews could get re-interested in their ancient traditional faith and ground their lives in its values. Wow, and he pulled it off to a great extent. And now, if you're a Reconstructionist rabbi all the way to being an ultra-Orthodox rabbi, if you don't engage in outreach, which the Rebbe invented, you won't hold a job. That's the extent of his contribution, let alone the Chabad now operates more outposts around the world than the United States government does. It's remarkable, it's true. It's absolutely remarkable. And I'm proud to be part of that. So I think it's a shame that
the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad is bigger than the...
That's true, I read about that. I was going to ask you about that.
Not for long.
The Rebbe clearly could not be the Messiah because he died without fulfilling Messianic prophecies. Interestingly, when Corey said that he was going to Israel for the first time, and that I had to abandon him that same morning, it was, the strangest providence. And Corey and I had prepared, as soon as he finished his exams at Oxford, he was in Noah's Rhodes Scholar class, that I was going to finally take him to Israel. And there, we were both packed, ready to go. I'm ready. My wife is about to pick us up, take us to Heathrow Airport, and I received a phone call from my father, who was in Israel visiting, and I was going to see him there as well, telling me that he just heard on Israel radio that the Rebbe had passed away. You have to imagine the blow that was. I called up Corey. I arranged for him to be taken care of by a friend, and I was already packed. Rushed to Heathrow and somehow made a plane, and I made it in time for the Rebbe's funeral. It was a cataclysmic event for Chabad, and maybe some could. They transmuted whatever they felt toward him in his life toward something they now feel in his death. But the Rebbe remains my inspiration, and I'm proud to say that, and it's something I celebrate. But I think the Messianism debate shouldn't even be had. It is clear that in normative Judaism forever, the Messiah is someone who will fulfill certain Messianic prophecies, and that includes bringing about world peace, and that includes ending war, contention, poverty, disease. There's a dispute whether he has to resurrect the dead. According to Maimonides, the Messiah everything will happen in the Messianic epoch in a very orderly, very natural way. I wrote a whole other book about this called The Wolf Shall Lie with the Lamb, available to find bookstores everywhere. And that's why Noach is correct. It's not a big deal to declare yourself the Messiah, because all we're going to do is judge you by whether or not you fulfill the Messianic prophecy. When I wrote this book, and so many of my Christian evangelical friends were sent early copies to give, especially pastors, to give us blurbs, a lot of them said, but what if Jesus does come back and rebuilds the temple and gathers in the remnant of the Jewish people and establishes Jewish sovereignty, etc.? And I said, what will you do then? I said, that would be very convincing. But that's really what it comes down to. So of course it's not a good look. No, Chaim Vital, many people, the student of the Rabbi Yosef, they said that he was the Messiah. I can go through a whole list of people. They believed that Shabtai Tzvi was the Messiah, and there was nothing wrong with that until he became an apostate and converted to Islam. and that became problematic.
Well,
Let alone he really did abrogate the Torah, unlike Jesus. Jesus did not abrogate the Torah.
yeah, I mean, in fact, the rabbi that I mentioned, this otherwise obscure 18th century rabbi, whose name was Jacob Emden, was a hater of the false Messiah Shabtai Tzvi, who was dead but who still had many followers. And precisely Emden's claim, it's kind of interesting, was that Christianity was great because Jesus had not abrogated the Torah, in his view, but had instructed Jews to keep on following the Torah. The idea that faith was sufficient was true for non-Jews who were Christians. And in his view, that was fine, whereas he thought that the false Messiah Shabtai Tzvi was bad for abrogating the Torah. And again, the reason this matters, I think, is really just that it suggests there is a long Jewish tradition of trying to reconcile with Christianity by offering an interpretation of Christianity, which many Christians would find to be unconvincing, but which people might accept as good enough for purposes of debate. But I think that takes us back to your debate with Fred, Shmuley, and I would like to turn back to you guys. I was very interested in this question of whether dialogue around questions of theology is worthwhile or not. And in a sense, that's exactly what Shmuley is doing in this book. I mean, this book could be an extraordinarily popular book with a non-Jewish audience if Shmuley had simply said, in this book I do not address the question of Jesus, whether Jesus was divine. I leave that to your own personal faith. He could have stopped the book about 2/3 of the way through, and I have no doubt that it would have sold tens of millions of copies.
You're making me feel real bad.
But what's interesting to me in part about the book is that Shmuley goes out of his way to spend 60 pages or so offering a classic Jewish polemical argument against Christianity, explaining why no one could possibly accept the fundamental tenet of Christianity. So once you're going down that road, you're asking for commonality to be on something else. Right? You're saying, well, commonality can be about Jesus' life, to which a Christian might respond, that's commonality on your terms, but it's not commonality on my terms, because it's missing the most important part of the story.
True. So I would respond to that, and I would like to hear what Brett has to say about this, because that was one of Brett's essential points, that, dim the lights, let's not have this conversation of full disclosure. My response to that is, in the Council of Nicaea, that was convened by the Emperor Constantine, who of course makes Christianity the state religion, the outcome was that Jesus was both fully divine and fully human. So my response, and that is normative Christianity today, for Catholics and for Protestants. So my response is, fine, even if you disagree with me on the fully divine part, it's time finally to discuss the fully human part. One of the issues that I have about the divinity of Jesus is I think it has translated down into the American body politic in ways that aren't always healthy. For example, everyone's saying that the political field is not what it ought to be. Now, I'm not here to criticize anyone because this isn't a political conversation. But I will say, I think now that I am seriously considering a run for Congress, and many of you have read about that, and I have 4 weeks to decide, and I'm actively doing things like raising money and things that candidates do, because I'd like to bring a values conversation to the American political arena. I'm really engaging in this question. Why don't more people run? And I think the principal reason is they are tired of the media exposing them as frauds, as charlatans. No one can withstand the scrutiny. Now, what if we got rid of the standard of perfection that I think trickles down from a divine Christ, and embraced instead the standard of struggle that trickles down from a human Jesus? The word Israel means he who wrestles with God, he who struggles. And we just accept that people are going to struggle and wrestle, they're going to make mistakes, but they still can make a
But then why didn't you write that book? Why didn't you write a book that said there are these two aspects of Christianity? This book is only about the human side. Why did you have to then spend 60 pages arguing? And I think the answer is you have a deep religious commitment in the picture. You care. And Brett is saying, you have the part you care about, they have the part they care about, and what do you know? That's the part where they disagree.
Look, I mean, I think it's important. I mean, you may as well say it. But I don't know a Jew who isn't at some level convinced that Christianity is preposterous. Now,
I'll say for the record that I don't think so.
One second. So
I certainly don't say that.
The applause here is, but I'm interested in the applause because clearly and I said it in part, curious for the reaction, because what I just said expresses a deeply held view among most Jews, which we are simply too polite to say most of the time, at least when we're not sitting around tables. And if I can imagine that if you are a committed Christian who actually takes your faith seriously and doesn't treat it as kind of a certain kind of gloss on core, might say the same thing about Judaism itself, or if not preposterous, then at least antiquated or harsh or heartless, or in some ways quite limited. This is not a conversation we want to have. We're all sitting here singing Kumbaya in a very interesting way. I assume there are Christians and Jews together in this room. And if we really started having this conversation, leaving aside who Jesus may have been, if he indeed existed, I just said it, we would be at daggers drawn. Well, this is New York City, so we would be, I don't know, no, there are no guns. This is Bloomberg town. I mean, we would be throwing salts and, saturated fats at one another. It would be terrible. So,
while riding bikes.
What kind of conversation do we want to have, and do we want to cultivate? It's a much softer conversation that goes by this term, which you broached near the end of the book, about Judeo-Christian values. And this is, in some ways, a productive conversation to have, because indeed, for all of the differences, you might make a plausible argument that this thing called Judeo-Christian values, which actually are Judeo-Christian Hellenistic values, I need to resuscitate the reputation of Greece, despite what its creditors might think of it, that this is actually a set of values which are broadly consonant with the core ideas of the West in their ancient and modern incarnations, and which are in some important and very distinct way different from a different set of faith traditions and cultural traditions, mainly Confucian traditions and Islamist traditions. And so it's important to have some kind of commonality, or at least cloak ourselves in this pleasant little but relatively shallow conversation about everything that we have. You talk, and I couldn't agree with you more, speaking personally, but there's nothing more boring to me than the conversation about gay marriage and completely irrelevant to the core moral issues of our time. But I think it would be an insult to a lot of intelligent Christians to say, why are you talking about this boring subject? Who cares about gay marriage? They care, and they care very deeply about this subject, and there's no glossing over it or saying we really should be talking about the deeper issues. And by the way, Shmuley and I agree 100% on everything, except when we're on the panel together. But they have some sincere commitments, and above all, we need to understand that while we can sit together, we can have interesting conversations, we can't forget that serious Jews have sincere and serious commitments. Serious and sincere Christians have the same, and they are often incompatible. So best not to talk about them. Like in any marriage, there has to be some things, there has to be what was a don't ask, don't tell policies. It's what's kept my marriage going for 10 years. It's getting away too much.
I want to pick up on that a little bit, though, because to some degree it raises the question then, Shmuley, were you really hoping to persuade serious Christians that their tradition has been manipulated to such a degree, and that new formulation, the formulation that was sort of post-Matthew, more as you describe it from Paul, that which has existed for nearly 2,000 years now, is false or somehow misguided?
Well, I don't think I have to say it's false, and I don't say it's false in the book. I think it's a question of emphasis. In other words, you're asking me, Shmuley, did you really think you convinced Christians with your book? My response is, there was an opening to teach them about the Jewish Jesus well before I wrote this book. I wrote the book to cater to an existing need. I wasn't trying to create the need. Christians all across America, especially evangelicals, want to learn about the Jewishness of Jesus. And they understand that some of what they're going to discover, Brett, is not going to be compatible with their traditional beliefs. But they still want to learn. And they're prepared. And I think it's patronizing to say to them, well, we don't want to say everything because it's going to lead to a conflict. They're big boys. They're big girls. They can hear the truth of what we believe. They don't have to necessarily embrace it. In the same way that I speak to, when I was at Oxford, Our L'chaim Society had 5,000 members, thank God. Noach was a very active member. Corey was our president, etc. There were some students who didn't like Israel. It was Oxford, after all. It was the United Kingdom, after all, where there's a lot of hostility toward Israel. And we had honest conversations, and it didn't mean that we had any kind of falling out. And I preferred the honesty of those conversations. I think a fraudulent relationship has to be avoided at all costs. And I think that Christians want to hear from us what we really feel, so long as it's backed up by Scripture. It can't just be conjecture, and it can't be opinion. This book is a scholarly book that is based on the New Testament, on Christian Scripture. So when Christians think, okay, well, the Jews were involved in the death of Christ, even if we evangelicals today have reformulated his death to say that he still volunteered to give himself over to the Romans, and it was therefore him laying his life down. Still, you guys engineered it. That isn't even what the Gospels say. The Gospels say in Luke chapter 15, verse 31, that the Pharisees saved Jesus' life when Herod tried to kill him, well before Pilate wanted to kill him. Luke chapter 13, verse 1, the same chapter. Jesus is told by his followers that Pontius Pilate is such a monster that he regularly kills Galileans who are seen as possibly rebellious and mixes their blood with the blood of the animal sacrifices. And Jesus says to them, if any of you think these people are worse than you, if you're sinful, Pilate will do it to you as well. Here you have Jesus calling Pilate a monster. It is not me telling Christians my opinion of New Testament scholarship. It is my quoting the New Testament to show them that you are not focusing on the whole story. So I think it's a question of emphasis. And as far as Brett's, what I love about Brett, and if you read him every Tuesday, and he writes many of the op-eds as well, no one's at the Wall Street Journal, you're always trying to figure out who writes the daily editorials, and they're not allowed to say, but I feel I can always get a handle on when Brett is writing some of the editorials. Brett is extremely forthright, very opinionated, and what I love about him is he says exactly what he thinks. But on the comment about Christianity, I have to disagree. I don't judge a truth system primarily by my ability to prove it to be true or not, especially when, as North pointed out, the historical literature is scant in this case. I look at truth also in its ability to impact, its ability to have an effect. So do I believe that Joseph Smith found tablets buried in northwestern New York State, written in Reformed Egyptian, and put on seer stones and was able to translate them? I do not believe that. But do I believe that Joseph Smith alighted on certain universal truths that he incorporated into Mormonism? Of course. I have lived 15 years or longer, 20 years among Mormons. I lecture regularly in Utah. Their commitment to a righteous life, to charity, to family is a very serious one. So there are truths that are in that religion that I, of course, can accept, that are not only not absurd, but are part of the universal value system that I think are part and parcel of the universal truths. Same thing, of course, is true of Christianity. The Catholic Church runs the largest network of hospitals, orphanages, schools in the entire world. I had the great honor of meeting Pope Benedict XVI in Rome. I took my kids to even meet him. He is one of the great friends of the Jewish community. I would say perhaps even greater than his predecessor, John Paul II, and he doesn't get the credit for it, because he's the one who wrote the theological papers under John Paul that allowed John Paul to go to synagogue, and this Pope has been to 3 synagogues in the 5-6 years of his pontificate, let alone John XXIII, who was by far the greatest of the popes. So to say that it's an absurdity when it does so much good, it was an absurdity when it did so much bad. When Christianity was rife with anti-Semitism and was responsible for auto-da-fés, expulsions, pogroms, that was an absurdity. Because it took the most famous Jew that ever lived and put a white cap on him and made him part of the Klan. That was an absurdity. And it's not true. Do I believe for one moment that John chapter 8, where Jesus says that all Jews are children of the devil and that we can never know our Father in heaven, is something he honestly said? Absolutely not. And I will tell it to my Christian brothers and sisters. It is absolutely incompatible with everything else he says. And you have to choose, because the things are not compatible. If you look at Matthew chapter 12, where Jesus is asked by a non-Jewish woman to heal her daughter, and Jesus said, "It is not for me to take the bread of the children and give it to the dogs," referring to non-Jews as dogs, because he was very xenophobic. Jesus was focused exclusively on the Jews, as would be consistent with someone fighting for Jewish causes. And then she says, but teacher, isn't it true when some of the crumbs fall on the floor that the dogs can lick them up? And Jesus says, you basically outsmarted me. So he blesses her daughter and she heals. But here is a very different view of non-Jews.
Can I just interrupt for just 1 second? This is my question. I can accept A, the value of dialogue on the basis of common values if you can find them. I can accept B, that even where there's disagreement on questions of theology, in a conversation you might consciously or unconsciously affect the emphasis within somebody else's religion, and they might similarly affect the emphasis within your own religion. So far so good. But what I'm curious about is what you see as the upside of debate of the kind you were just engaged in, where one says to a believer, well, look at your own scripture. These parts of the scripture and these parts of scripture are inconsistent. So you must choose between them. And you must deny the accuracy of some in favor of others. And I would just guess, Shmuley, if someone mounted similar arguments to you with respect to Jewish sources, divinely sanctioned Jewish sources, you would either, A, say, I can show that in fact they are consistent, or if you were really pressed and the person said, well, they just plainly are inconsistent, you would say, well, you know what, I believe that they are consistent. I may not be able to convince you, but my belief stands for that. And I take it that there's nothing wrong with saying that, but I also take it that that's the point at which it becomes hard to convince the other person.
Well, I would approach it a different way. I would not say that a Christian has to choose between the authenticity of one verse when it seems to be in contradiction to the other.
That's what you're exactly just saying.
So let me totally take back everything I said. let me retreat ever so slightly. So let me clarify. As you well know, Noah. And by the way, Noah's argument is an interesting one because it was made by his great teacher, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, and you were close with Rabbi Soloveitchik.
No. I was much too young. But
okay, but part of the
I was educated in schools that he founded.
Right, and he was opposed to theological discussions.
Flatly prohibited them.
Right. So I would say the following. I'm not saying that Christians have to say John chapter 8 is not authentic. I am saying that in the same way that we Jews have an oral tradition which interprets the written tradition, Christians are forced now to reinterpret what Jesus said. It could mean that Jesus said all Jews who are the worst kinds of sinners are children of the devil. Keep the verse, but you have to understand it differently. Just as we understand things very differently, the analogy isn't perfect, but in the Constitution, we use the Supreme Court to interpret what the Constitution says, and we don't change the text, but our understanding changes. And there is a need to re-understand these things, because if you understand it literally, you're left with Jews being the children of the devil, which is what has justified anti-Semitism for so long. And it is, in my opinion, immoral to take a Jew and make him an enemy of his people. And I do believe that universal morality must govern the actions of all religions. Is that not what we Jews tell our Islamic brothers and sisters? That whatever rage they feel, there are certain laws, like in the Ten Commandments, about do not murder when it comes to civilians. We tell it to ourselves as well. We have to be a self-critical community. When we do things that contravene our values and our laws, there's a universal morality that overrides even Scripture, that to which all religions subscribe. So I'm talking about reinterpreting those verses. But I certainly believe that, given that Christians believe that Jesus is fully human and fully divine, that the fully human part, which is the Jewish part, has yet to be fully explored. It is their desire to explore it, and we have to write more things like this book to do so, even if they don't agree with all conclusions.
I think we're going to start to open this fascinating conversation up to you, the audience. I would ask that if you have a question, you state it succinctly, and please no speeches, just questions. You can direct your question to the entire panel or to one individual, and there's a gentleman in the back there who has been straining to ask something, so you can go first.
Good evening, my name is Shlomo Gewurz, and my question is directed to Brett. It would appear from your writing that you're a believer in American exceptionalism. So my question to you is, do you believe there's such a thing as Jewish exceptionalism? If you don't believe that, then your position is very understandable. But if you do believe that there is such a concept of Jewish exceptionalism, then why can't we go out there? Why do we have to dim our eyes? Why can't we go out there with our eyes wide open?
Is that just a momentary glasses at the moment, or?
No, they're actually filthy. Do I believe in American exceptionalism? Yes. Do I believe in Jewish exceptionalism? Yes. And those are two exceptionalisms which are happily, in my view, fully compatible. what I take your question to mean is, if we believe in this, why can't we state it very openly and assertively? Well, there's no reason to some extent, there's no reason we shouldn't. There are also considerations of tact that I think are sort of, naturally incumbent on everyone. There's also a consideration, Noah said something that I found quite moving. That we are in a country where during one of the greatest financial crises in our history, there hasn't been, well, you don't have my readers. There has been anti-Semitism, but only among real sort of lunatic scumbags. But there's been next to no anti-Semitism. I actually often think that what is it about this country that our greatest national security secret is betrayed by a Jewish couple, the atomic bombs, the secrets of the atomic bomb, and yet there were no pogroms in the 1930s. Imagine if that had happened in Russia. There would have been, Khrushchev would have resurrected his Oxford plot and murdered millions of Jews. It didn't happen in the United States. Look, I mean, why can't we go forward? Look at what Shmuley's doing. We are. I'm just saying that in this very specific dialogue that we're having with Christians vis-a-vis Israel, there are probably conversations best left unsaid.
Thank you. Another.
Hi. In the evangelical community, there's a lot of questioning of WWJD. What would Jesus do? They try to emulate the life of Jesus in their daily life. And I was wondering, given that, while you were writing this book, if you were in any way trying to be a sort of a quiet Jewish evangelist of your own, trying to persuade today's Christians that maybe they would do better to become Jewish so that they could really emulate Jesus and that they, to WWJD, they could do what Jesus does, wake up in the morning, crunch fill and observe Shabbat, eat kosher, not go to work on Shmini and Sarah, all those other types of things.
How are you, Yossi Siegel? Thank you very much for coming. Yossi's a good friend. To be honest, no. We're not a proselytizing faith. We're not an evangelizing faith. And I really respect that because it means that you don't have to upgrade your existence to be closer to God or achieve a closer proximity to God by becoming a Jew. I think what makes my 20-year friendship with Mayor Cory Booker, who spoke at the beginning, is the fact that Cory and I studied Judaism probably 4 or 5 times a week for 2 years at Oxford and for the 18 years since. Not every day anymore, but on the phone constantly, etc. And it was clear from the beginning, this was never going to be about him becoming Jewish. I wanted Cory to deepen his commitment to his Christianity. But I did want him to understand the Jewishness of Jesus more greatly, which is why, the first blurb on the back of this book is from Cory. And I put it there purposely at the top because Cory was, for years I've been asking my friend Shmuley to write this book. There are a lot of Christians who study Judaism. They now want to understand how the Jewishness of Jesus can enrich their Christianity, not by becoming Jewish. It is true that the religion of Jesus was Judaism, not Christianity. Christianity would have been utterly foreign to Jesus. He would not recognize it at all. He was Jewish through and through. And as I said, Matthew chapter 5, verse 18 makes that absolutely clear, as do other verses. But what I do believe is that the Jews should be evangelizing the world towards Jewish values, the universality of Jewish values. And in this respect, coming back to Brett's comment again about the absurdity of Christianity, I really disagree with that because there's something that Christians did that we Jews failed to do completely. Although I am critical of Paul on many levels, for reasons that the book details, there's one thing that St. Paul did that has no precedent. He looked at the Jewish religion, he saw in it something that was very enriching, and he said, you know what? This could be the most successful idea in the history of the world. And he made modifications to it, to be sure, but he took the God of Israel and the Sabbath and the story of creation and Genesis and all of our values, and he made them the most successful idea in the history of the world. There are 1.8 billion Christians in the world. There's 2 Jews. And they say, and that's why we all struggle with things like support for Israel. There really is not a critical mass of Jews in countries like Europe to put pressure on their governments, like your heavy involvement in AIPAC, to be pro-Israel. There just aren't enough Jews.
And
Now,
the Jews were there anti-Israel anyway, so that's
yeah, well, that's a good point. Not all of them, but too many. So, I believe in it. Why didn't we see what Paul saw? They say that Jews are good businessmen. Really? That's what we're known for. We're great businessmen. Which businessman or woman allows all of their intellectual ideas to be taken without attribution? We gave the world God, his name is Jesus Christ. We gave the world the Sabbath, it's called Sunday. We gave the world the Ten Commandments, it's called morality. We gave the world every man created in the image of God, it's called democracy. Nothing goes by a Jewish name anymore, so I give Paul tremendous credit. But, I believe we've come to a point where Christians are now portraying those values in ways here in America that are becoming increasingly divisive, and I think we should be proselytizing people to universal Jewish values while they remain in their original religion. Let's give you one example, because I think it was Noah who mentioned it before. Noah said, if Christians feel that gay marriage, or was it you, Brett?
Brett said.
I'm sorry, Brett said that you agree with me that this is a distraction, but if they feel this is real, it's real. But wait a second. Our Christian brothers and sisters believe that gay marriage should be the foremost moral issue in America based on our Bible, not in Christian. There's nothing about homosexuality in the teachings of Jesus. It comes from our Torah. It comes from the book of Leviticus. And they say the reason is because God uses the word abomination. But they don't focus on the fact that the word abomination appears 122 times in the Torah. Why did they choose this abomination? By far, Noah's a great Torah scholar, anyone who is will tell you, by far, the foremost sin you can commit in our Bible is desecration of the Sabbath. By far. In fact, there's only 2 stories of people being put to death in the 5 books of Moses. And one was someone who blasphemed against God, and the other guy is someone who desecrated the Sabbath. No 2 gay guys running around in Genesis. So they're basing it on our scripture. Shouldn't we be teaching them and putting it into context? And this is a debate that I had with Jerry Falwell, Aloha Shalom, on Larry King's show, where he said, Rabbi, you must not be Orthodox, you must be Reformed because it says abomination. And I asked him, how many times does it say the word abomination in the Bible? He didn't know. I only knew because I Googled it moments before the show. God bless Google. No offense, Apple. So, of course we should be evangelizing them to universal Jewish values, because I think it would make America so much less divisive. By the way, that's one of the reasons. A lot of my friends who are here tonight were a little bit disappointed that I announced that I want to run for Congress. They said, do you want to be a politician? No, I want to be a values voice in the political arena, whether you win or lose. It's time for people to start talking about real values, beginning with what I said, that let's drop the gay marriage debate and make marital counseling tax deductible in the United States so that couples can really get the help that they need. If my parents had gotten the counseling, they couldn't afford it. And I know a lot of couples that can't afford it. But when's the last time you heard any rabbi, from Reconstructionist to ultra-Orthodox, get up on a Saturday morning and give a speech about abortion or gay marriage? It just doesn't happen. So I think that Jewish values need to make a resurgence. And the reason it doesn't, we have no Pauls in our midst, people who actually believe that Jewish values have universal application. Let me just conclude by saying, during Roman times prior to the birth of Jesus and prior to the spreading of these values by Paul, 10% of the Roman Empire were Judaizers. They were Roman pagans who had become disillusioned with the religion of Rome, and they turned to the Jews without becoming Jewish, and they believed in the God of Israel. You can look it up, the Encyclopedia Judaica has a very interesting entry on the Judaizers, but I think we can recreate something similar here.
Yes, there's a woman back there. Yes, you.
My question is for Rabbi Shmuley. You spoke very recently of the consistency and contradictory verses in the gospel and how it should maybe put them under reinterpretation. So I'm wondering, you seem very familiar with the history of the Nicaea Council. Wouldn't it be more advisable or more, you could take it under consideration to maybe take that history into consideration and see that those gospels and many of those statements were changed and manipulated to fit a political agenda?
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm actually going to flip most of this question over to Noah, because I'm not looking just at the historicity and to knock Christianity. That is not my purpose. My purpose is to glorify Christianity and to connect it with its Jewish roots. No, it was you who said that one of your major criticisms of me is that I'm asking Christians to choose. What about the idea that there is an oral tradition in the Torah which lends significant reinterpretation to verses that don't change? Let me just start with one famous example. Jesus, in the most famous speech ever given was the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, I took my family to the Mount of Beatitudes where Jesus gave it. I wanted to see exactly, the multitude of people. And he requotes the Torah, as I show in the book. But he starts by saying, you have heard it said that an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say, clear distinction, the Torah is vengeful, the Torah is bloodthirsty. But I say, love your enemies. But no, you know what our interpretation of that verse has always been, going back to Jesus' times, right? Which is?
Well, so there are two different things on the table. So Shmuley is referring to a tradition which it's actually only recorded in Jewish sources later than Jesus' time, but it no doubt dates from earlier.
Well, the Mishnah is from Jesus' time.
And the Mishnah is recorded in around 200, 200 CE.
Earlier debates and discussions.
Yeah, but if we're talking about historicity, you got to call it what it is. It's a document from about 130 years after 150 years after Jesus' life, but it does record a view, which is there's every reason to believe was an earlier view, according to which an eye for an eye is not to be taken literally, but is to be understood in terms of monetary compensation. And we know that that's a plausible earlier interpretation because the Code of Hammurabi, which is, again, if we're being historical, a substantially older document than the Hebrew Bible, already records both models. It records both punishments that are based upon direct retaliation and also punishments or compensatory schemes that are based on the compensation of the victim. But I think that part of what's interesting about the exchange that you had is that Catholicism, and really all Christianity until the Reformation, was a lot like traditional Judaism, in that nobody thought that the way you found out how to be a Christian was just to open the Bible and read it. Right? There were fathers of the church, there were councils of the church, like the Council at Nicaea, there were complex sociological and historical processes, just as there were in Jewish tradition, for interpreting early material, for deciding what was Christian theology, and for shaping the history of the church. And much of church history is precisely the history of those processes. Those are human processes. And again, the same is true of Jewish tradition. From the Reformation, a strand of Christianity developed, and it's become tremendously, widely influential, according to which one could find out the true meaning of what it meant to be a Christian by looking directly to the Gospels and reading them. And getting back to an original or reformed, that's the meaning of the word reform in Reformation, a reformed conception of these materials. So if you have that view, then it's easy to do, I don't mean to say that it's simple, but it is possible to ignore the church fathers, to ignore the teachings of the Catholic Church, to ignore perhaps even Paul, and go back and look at the Gospel, as Shmuley is doing in the book, and say this is what we ought to see. That will work as an argumentative strategy for interacting with some Christians. It won't work as an argumentative strategy for interacting with others.
Thank you. I think we have time for just 2 more questions. Yes, over here.
My name is Ron Singer. I want to thank Shmuley for having the courage to do this. This is an excellent forum, which if we go deeper and the history provides enough evidence for us to do so, we can actually take a look at all the world's religions, see where all of us went wrong, and find a way to publicize reasons why we don't need another jihad, which is shaping up in Iran. And my question is, would Shmuley and the rest of the historians be willing to go in depth into the historical evidence and see where we all do have common ground, irrespective of the religious beliefs we hold so dear that we're willing to die and kill for?
Can I make a comment to this effect? I was thinking a little bit about your comment about the universality of Jewish values and reflecting on what you said earlier about the differences and important differences between Christians and Jews. I mean, there is an aspect of modern American life, maybe it's the prevailing aspect, in which what we call morality, and some of us choose to call it Judeo-Christian morality or some Christian morality or something, is really a kind of smorgasbord humanism inflected with kind of conceits and concepts of what's divine. And that's not a bad thing. Actually, it's a very good thing. Benedict, the Pope, we mentioned, Benedict XVI, gave a very interesting speech at Regensburg in 2006, which I wrote very admiringly about and had all these developed actually friendships with Catholic priests who were somewhat disappointed that I'm Jewish, but that's another story. But what was interesting, I remain Jewish, and more proudly so than ever. But what was interesting, what I found interesting about this speech is, well, first of all, it's a speech that only a Straussian can appreciate, which is another concept. But anyway, what's very interesting about the speech is he begins by talking about the concept of the universality of reason. And his critique, and this is what created a storm about the speech, is what he claimed, what his critique was, and you would correct me if he was mistaken theologically. The point wasn't whether he was accurate or not. The point was that what holds the sort of, what he called the universe of reason together between believers and secularists, between Athens and Jerusalem and Rome, is this belief in a kind of all-powerful reason. And his critique of Islam is that the Islamic God, as Benedict interprets him, is a God who is capable of doing things that in some ways contradict the concept of reason. That God is beholden to no concept, in fact, not even beholden to no earthly concept, no human concept, not even beholden to concepts about truth and justice and morality, that transcends all of those categories. Now, I have no idea whether, and Benedict chooses a number of somewhat abstruse sources to justify his claim. So maybe his interpretation of Islam is wrong, but really the point that matters in the Regensburg speech is whether his concept of what binds Western civilization together is right, and that kind of what he called that universal reason, that ability for Christians and Jews and anyone who partakes of this universal civilization to have certain kinds of conversations, so long as reason is the ultimate test of their truthfulness or falsity. But that's what he's talking about. And in that sense, in that kind of in Benedict's conception, you can actually begin to have something like a fruitful conversation between Christians and Jews. But I think it's also, I would just add, I suspect it's a conversation that relatively few people can have.
I think we have time for just one last question. Yes, sir. Over there.
Question about one of the more concrete examples of Jewish-Christian interaction.
Could you stand up, please, and speak a little louder?
Sure. A question about one of the more concrete examples of Jewish-Christian interaction. That would be the 30,000 approximately known as Jewish citizens of the state of Israel who are Zionists or the army who happen to be believers in Christianity. And some of whom, should that information become public, were at risk for loss of employment or loss of citizenship even. So the question when we talk about expanding dialogue, how do we approach this question, and of course in the United States it's also present, about integrating why we can't have Jewish groups, Christian communities, or Jewish minorities?
Well, that's I don't know who else wants to deal with that. Can I broaden your question? If your question is specifically about Jewish believers in Jesus who are serving in the Israeli army, by the way, parenthetically, our second daughter just yesterday started in the Israeli army for 2 years, I believe, and she's training men. She's training men in combat. It's scary. And we have a son who was just, thank God, recently. We have a son who's a Chabad student emissary in Frankfurt, Germany, who was just recently nominated to West Point, God willing. He's on his final round now, but he was nominated by his congressman, and we're very grateful to his congressman for doing something. Yeah, I may be running against him, but I am very grateful to him. He's very gentlemanly, and yeah, I may be running against him. The Lord works in mysterious ways, what can I tell you? We're very proud of him. Anyone who serves, and yesterday, when I gave my first ever political speech to the Republican committee who will choose their nominee for the 9th District of New Jersey, I mentioned that my daughter's entered the Israeli army, knowing, for a lot of people it's kind of a foreign thing. And first of all, I'm very proud of her no matter what, of course. And but she's fighting for the freedom of a fledgling and very vulnerable democracy. in a very dangerous place. And I split in with everyone who fights in the Israeli army. I don't care what their beliefs are. I have been at the forefront of something you might see as a contradiction. On the one hand, I may have done more large-scale debates with Jews who believe in Jesus than maybe any other rabbi around today, given that me and Mike Brown have done at least 20, 25. I've done others as well. And Mike Brown is a world-class scholar, and he's a Jew who became a Christian at about 17. Our debates are on YouTube, and thousands of people come to those debates. And he's a very fine man. He came to my daughter's wedding. If you look at the debates, you'll think that they're taking no prisoners debates, but we become friends. And I try to stop everything he's doing, and he tries to stop everything I'm doing, but he's a decent man. But one thing I've also always said is that a Jew is a Jew is a Jew is a Jew, and I am not with those who say that if a Jew believes in Jesus, they're no longer Jewish. If the maternal line is that which determines Jewishness, then there's no exceptions to it, period. And as far as those Jews whose fathers are Jewish and whose mothers are not, I am definitely a voice in the community saying that we should be doing everything in our power for those children who would like to explore their Jewishness, given that they have a Jewish parent, and make it and facilitate a proper halachic conversion, but give them special treatment without bending any Jewish laws, because we're all one people and one nation. And as long as Jewish law halacha is upheld, then. But the halacha says, the Jewish law says, that these people are Jewish. And if they're fighting for the Israeli army, I don't care what their beliefs are. And if they want to make Aliyah to Israel and they're Jewish, then they should be able to make Aliyah. I know that that's not the policy of the Israeli government. I think they should say that they're not going to proselytize. Look, let me tell you, Jews for Jesus comes to people who are committed members of Jews for Jesus or Messianic Jewish Alliance or chosen people ministries. They come to our house for Shabbos dinner. But I always say to them, very respectfully, because they're my friends, I do debates with them, and I organize debates with them. I say, well, with respect, of course, you're not going to bring this up to the table because it's not appropriate. And they respect it, they don't. Because it isn't appropriate. Because that's not what my guests are coming to my Sabbath table to discover. And a debate, it's fine. That's what they're coming for. And as long as people are respectful of that, I think we can all. But if they're fighting for Israel, God bless them. Israel is really a country. If you have not read Brett's article yesterday, you must read it. It is scary. It is accurate. And it is the best article I've read on the Iranian nuclear. But when I finished reading it, honestly, I wanted to give up almost everything else I was doing, seriously, and focus entirely on the Iranian threat. That's how much you convinced me that that Israel can end, God forbid, as a result of this. And Brett is one of the most respected writers in the United States of America. And it's a very sober assessment of how Israel's defense is. If Israel is forced to attack Iran, and then Hezbollah and Hamas launch, with Iran, retaliatory strikes, it will overwhelm. No one's even focusing on that part. We're focusing on Israel, the nuclear threat from Iran. How many rockets did they have? 200,000. 200,000. That would easily overwhelm Israel's defenses. There's no way Israel can defend against that.
Well, a lot of them will fall harmlessly, but 200,000 is a lot of rockets.
And whoever wants to defend against that, God bless them. But they should not be proselytizing in Israel because it's not appropriate. Let me just finalize it because we're at the end. Just my own final comments. Just thank you very quickly. Then you'll wrap up just as someone will convene us. Jane, I cannot thank you enough for having been here this evening. And people should read the forward. You're doing an outstanding job there. I love highbrow journalism, especially highbrow Jewish journalism, and that's what the forward is all about. God bless you. Thank you. To my wife, who makes everything I do possible, but who left. Have their shoulders. Okay. It's not easy being the wife of the rabbi. I was very fortunate that my publisher hired Rubenstein PR, who did Kosher Sex and a few of my other books, to do Kosher Jesus as well. Richard Rubenstein is himself here, along with his entire team, Judy Lee, and Josh, and all the people who are working on my book. Richard, thank you for everything. Richard is the #1 PR expert in all of New York, maybe in the United States, and I'm very honored and grateful to have you doing that. I mentioned in the audience, Rabbi Ashla Patton, I saw that he's here. Ashla Patton was the first ever Orthodox Jewish Rhodes Scholar in Oxford University's 900-year history. And today he's one of the most successful communal rabbis. He actually chose as a Rhodes Scholar to become a communal rabbi. You are Meshuggah and nonsense, okay? And he runs one of the most successful congregations in the United States. And he's in the midst of building a community in Beersheba in Israel, which might happen soon. And I'm very honored that you came. Ashla is from Chicago. My dear friend Ken Kurson, who opened the event tonight. and who's one of the most highly respected Republican political operatives in the United States, and gives me a lot of advice about things, but he's a very committed Jew, and he ran the Giuliani campaign nationally. Although he's not completely observant, he chose to observe the Sabbath as his respect for his people and his religion. I think it's one of the most courageous decisions in the history of American politics, and you have my deep respect, Ken. Thank you. Finally, Noach, you've been a dear friend for 20 years, and we're also proud of your magnificent achievements. At Noach's age, he is considered one of the greatest legal scholars alive, and you're very busy with your teaching schedule, and I'm very honored that you made the trip down from Boston specifically to be part of this panel. And Brett, what can I say? You were my editor, you're my friend. May your father's memory be a very deep and endless blessing to you. I know he's inspired, you and I had conversations about him, I know he inspired so much of the man you are. And that was only 2 months ago, right? So I know it's very raw, and I hope we wish you God's comfort. And may so much of what you do accrue to his eternal memory and blessing. And Jane is going to close up, but the person who's going to say thank you from our side was one of our governors, and one of the outstanding Jewish philanthropists in the United States. Very involved in many things, from APAC, God knows how many Jewish causes my dear friend David Sterling. But Jane, let me hand everything over to you. Again, Jane, thank you very much for your moderation.
Thank you, Shmuley. We'll just have a few closing words. Before that, I just want to remind you that there will be books for sale, and I bet they could be autographed, too. There are also copies of the latest Forward, which I hope that you will pick up, read, and subscribe. You can also follow us on forward.com. You've been a really spectacular audience, so please join me in thanking all of our guests.
I was remiss about one thing. I'm so sorry. Corey was saying the last one. I apologize. The title of the book, we were sitting around my Shabbos table discussing the title of the book, and it was my friend Scott Pellegrino sitting right in front that said, after all your kosher books, it should be Kosher Jesus. Now I know you said that just to get my life ended by all my critics. But thank you for that suggestion, and I'm very grateful, Scott. Thank you.
Shmuley has introduced me. I am David Sterling, and on behalf of the Board of Trustees of This World, the Values Network, I want to just show my appreciation for the panel here that's done a really spectacular job. I really enjoyed it. The Forward is a newspaper that my mother is constantly sending me articles about, and Brett.
That's why you should subscribe.
I'm constantly sending my mother articles from the Wall Street Journal, so, and I probably should subscribe. And I was just thrilled to hear Noah's comments, and Shmuley, you're always really a treat. I want to remind everybody that this event was brought to you by This World Jewish Values Network, and it is a not-for-profit organization that survives solely on your generous donations. And if you'd like to see more events like this, or you like what you've seen here, please, on the back of your programs, you will notice that there is an opportunity to give. Please give generously and often. And I will also reiterate what Jane has pointed out, that Shmuley will be here to sign the books, and the books are for sale here. And so please don't leave without getting your copy. Thank you again.